Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Rod and Jeff, for inviting me to talk. It's an honor to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? A little louder? So, I am at least financially unconflicted. Many people think of health, when they think of health, they think of physical health. However, studies have shown conclusively that the head is part of the body. And so if you are crippled with panic attacks or have debilitating depression, you are not healthy. If this gingerbread man were to describe himself as healthy, we would call him delusional. So I am a psychiatrist. I've been a psychiatrist for 17 years. For the past 12 years in college mental health. For the first 6 or 7 of those at Harvard, and now at Smith College, a women's college in Western Massachusetts. And what we're noticing across the country in college mental health is really disturbing trend. The first-year students, 18 years old, arriving on campus, more and more of them each year, arriving on campus already taking 2, 3, 4 psychiatric medications. Students coming in for crisis visits every day, panic attacks, self-injurious behaviors, suicidal ideation, professors and deans walking students over on a regular basis, worried about manic behavior or psychosis or anorexia. So what in the world is going on? And what does this mean about our future? So it turns out the trend is actually global. It's not just about college mental health. And it's not just the United States. Now, these numbers are likely underestimates because it's actually very challenging to count people with mental illness around the world. So about 322 million people are estimated to have depression. That's about the same number of people as live in the United States. That's up 18% in roughly the past decade, and now the #1 cause of disability in the world. 800,000 people die per year from suicide, and that's now the #2 cause of death among young people worldwide. Anxiety disorders also up about 18% in roughly the past decade. And dementia, the numbers are expected to triple by 2050. Why? Why is this happening? What is driving these trends in colleges and all around the world? Do we know anything about the root causes is there anything we can do about this, or is this just how it's supposed to be? Well, there are some theories that have been around a long time about what causes these mental health problems. The neurotransmitter deficit theory, stress, trauma, and of course your mother. So what about this modern atrocity? Might this have a little something to do with it? We have learned the hard way, as many other speakers have just told you, about how dangerous this diet is, this modern diet, for our physical health. So it stands to reason, why should the brain be any different? So if we could prevent psychiatry from going the same way, that would be wonderful. Psychiatry as a field is in its infancy, nutritional psychiatry, so hopefully we can go in a different direction and learn from others' mistakes. But I believe that the decline in mental health around the world has a lot to do with the decline in the quality of our diet over the past 75 years, and I think that's catching up with us. And I believe that it may be one of the primary driving factors behind many mental illnesses. So can we look to the past to guide us going forward into the future? We do know that psychosis was exceedingly rare in traditional cultures compared to westernized counterparts. So what is it about westernization? Diet was one factor, but there, of course, were others. I believe diet was a very strong factor, and I hope to convince you of that today. I actually believe that there are 2 dietary patterns on the rise around the world. One because we are told it's healthy, and the other despite the fact that we know very well it is not healthy. The one we know is not healthy for us is the standard American diet, or what I'm going to call the SAD diet. This diet used to be called the Western diet, but it is now exported around the world. And what distinguishes the sad Western diet from other diets is the presence of refined and processed carbohydrates and the presence of refined and processed fats, not the presence of saturated fat, meat, or cholesterol. Refined and processed carbs up 32%, calories from sweeteners around the world between 1962 and 2000, and refined and processed fats up 3 to 6 times around the world between 1985 and 2010. So we know from epidemiological studies, which is usually the first step in trying to understand what's going on, that many mental health conditions are associated with the standard, sort of the sad Western diet. But these are just associations. We don't know anything about causality. This is just a hypothesis. So what did the randomized controlled trials tell us? So just sit back and relax, and I'm going to walk you through every randomized controlled trial there has been about diet and depression. All 2 of them. So both of these studies were done in the past year, and both in Australia. The SMILES trial and the Healthy Med trial. The researchers chose to compare a modified Mediterranean diet with the sad Western diet. And they did find that there was some modest improvement in depression symptoms in the people who switched to the Mediterranean diet. Now, this is compared to the sad Western diet. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the Mediterranean diet is the best diet for the brain. It just means that it's better. But of course, what diet isn't better than the standard American diet? But I do believe that there are many good things about the Mediterranean diet. I define it for myself as a post-agricultural whole foods diet. It's very low in processed foods, low in refined oils, low in refined carbohydrates. So we don't know, although many people believe that it has something to do with magical ingredients in the Mediterranean diet like olive oil or nuts or wine, that it is really may have more to do with what's not in it rather than what is in it. So in terms of the signature ingredients in the standard American diet, the SAD diet, they really are the refined carbohydrates and the refined oils. So what do we know already about how those affect the brain? We actually know a lot. So both of those ingredients are very powerful promoters of inflammation and oxidation. All of these mental health disorders are strongly linked to inflammation and oxidation, just like so many other illnesses are. So the way sugar causes inflammation and oxidation, one way anyway, is that it floods your chemical pathways and overwhelms your natural internal antioxidants, tilting your system too far towards oxidation and away from antioxidation. The way that refined seed oils do this, the way they cause inflammation, is by competing with anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acid, particularly one called EPA. So if you eat soybean oils, for example, which are very high in omega-6, linoleic acid, then what you've done is you've tilted the scales. Because these compete with each other, you're now tilting your whole system too far towards inflammation and too far away from healing. There have been many trials attempting to use EPA supplements, fish oil supplements and such, in various mental health conditions. Unfortunately, the results are rather unimpressive, except perhaps when it comes to delaying the onset of psychosis. Most of these trials are underwhelming. There's another way, a second way, in which refined foods, particularly carbohydrates, destabilize brain chemistry. And that's through this invisible internal hormonal roller coaster. So when the average person, probably not in this room, eats sugary meals 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day with flour, sugar, cereals, juice, etc. And so they get a nice big glucose spike and they get a nice insulin spike on its tail, and that brings the blood sugar back down. And so what's the problem? The problem is that insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator. Insulin is a powerful master hormone of growth that regulates lots of other hormones in the body, including the sex hormones and the stress hormones. So what you get is, as the blood sugar is coming down, if it's coming down too quickly, the body will perceive that as an emergency and release stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And these are your fight or flight hormones, particularly adrenaline. And some people are quite sensitive to this, to the release of these hormones, and can experience very uncomfortable symptoms, in between meals. Panic attacks, insomnia if it happens in the middle of the night, intense cravings for carbohydrates, irritability, all kinds of things. So is it any wonder that these conditions are on the rise around the world if most people are eating this way now? And if you're wondering, what's the degree of this problem, just take a look at what happens to teenage boys who drink sugar-sweetened beverages compared to a sugar-free cola drink. That's their adrenaline level spiking to nearly 5 times its baseline about 4 or 5 hours later. So this is not subtle. And for most people, this is happening, again, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. Now, the third way that the modern American diet, standard diet, is damaging the brain is through insulin resistance. So we know that people with depression are a little bit more likely to have type 2 diabetes, which is just an end-stage form of insulin resistance. We know that people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are at very high risk compared to the average population of type 2 diabetes. And people with Alzheimer's disease, a staggering 80% of them have either insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. But these are just associations, so this doesn't mean anything about causality. We do have a few studies which give us clues that perhaps insulin resistance, inflammation, etc., are more than just associated, that they actually may be playing a role in how severe somebody's symptoms might be. So here is an interesting study about bipolar disorder. Took a group of people with bipolar disorder, tested them for insulin resistance and diabetes. The rates were actually quite high. And they discovered that in people with bipolar disorder who had insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, they were more likely to have chronic symptoms, they were more likely to be rapid cycling, and they were less likely to respond to the mood stabilizer lithium. Now, and that's very interesting, because it suggests that insulin resistance may actually be playing a role in the disease process. With Alzheimer's disease, I said psychiatry is a field, nutritional psychiatry, in its infancy. Alzheimer's disease is a very mature field, a scientific field right now in terms of understanding how insulin resistance affects the brain. So we now, many of us, call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. And the reason for that is that it seems as though there's multiple lines of high-quality evidence indicating that insulin resistance is not just associated with Alzheimer's. Insulin resistance seems to be a primary driving force causing most cases of garden variety Alzheimer's disease. And this could be an entire talk in of itself, and it has been, but just one key point is that insulin resistance, the way it affects the brain, is that the blood-brain barrier itself becomes resistant to insulin, not to glucose. Glucose can flow right in, no questions asked. Plenty of glucose gets into the brain, even if you have type 2 diabetes, severe insulin resistance. The problem is that insulin has a difficult time getting into the brain, and that's a problem because the brain is an energy hog. It needs a constant supply. It's an electrical organ. It's very busy. So it needs a constant supply of high-quality energy. It often prefers glucose, but can also use ketones. So, if insulin can't get in to burn glucose, insulin is actually required for cells to turn glucose into energy. And if you don't get enough insulin in, the cells will begin to sputter and suffer energy deficits. And this can be especially problematic for the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, because that's an especially active area, and it's very sensitive to insulin deficits. So we have some handful of interesting studies of these drugs called PPAR gamma agonists. And these are medications which not only reduce insulin resistance, they're called insulin sensitizers, but they also have anti-inflammatory properties. So, and these are not antidepressants, but if you give them to people with severe depression, bipolar depression, treatment-resistant depression, they actually seem to help, which is very interesting, and it's sort of proof of concept that inflammation and insulin resistance are playing a role again in driving the disease process. It's all very early research. We also see that these medications can be helpful perhaps with psychosis and in cognitive deficits and early dementia. So when it comes to diet and mental health, if insulin resistance is an issue, well, how about a ketogenic diet? We know that that helps with other insulin resistance related conditions. Well, of course, we have a wealth of information going back over 100 years now, indicating that ketogenic diets, especially formulated low carbohydrate diets, can be very remarkably powerfully healing in serious neurological conditions, including epilepsy. And so why should the brain be any different in terms of psychiatric disorders? This dotted line that you see down the middle of the slide is the imaginary line between neurology and psychiatry. It really doesn't exist. What works for neurological conditions, it would stand to reason that it should work for psychiatric conditions. And there have been a handful of case reports and very, very small preliminary studies on this topic that you can read about more if you like. The other diet that I'm very worried about as a psychiatrist that's on the rise around the world is the plant-based diet. So the plant-based diets are vegan and vegetarian diets. These are really, there's a movement afoot. This is a really, Germany takes the lead. 44% of Germans now describe themselves as eating a low-meat diet. That's up from 26% just 3 years ago. And in the United States, there's been a 50% increase in vegetarians and vegans in the United States in the past 10 years alone. And veganism in particular has increased to 6% of Americans. That's up 500% in the past 3 years. So what's interesting if you look around the world is that there are actually 1.5 billion vegetarians estimated to live on the planet, but the vast majority of them are not vegetarian by choice. They're vegetarian because they can't access nutritious animal foods. About 5% are by choice. I call them voluntary vegetarianism, tends to trend with affluence and education. So how can I stand here and tell you that I'm worried about this plant-based diet being unhealthy for the brain when we have actual real-life clinical trials showing us that plant-based diets can be helpful, truly helpful, in metabolic disorders such as obesity, diabetes, and heart disease? I can tell you that confidently because they did not simply remove animal foods from these diets, no. What they did was they removed almost all of the fat. They manipulated multiple other lifestyle variables, often stress, smoking, etc. And lo and behold, they removed the refined carbohydrates. So how in the world are we supposed to know what is responsible for the benefits of these diets? It may have had nothing to do with plantfulness or animalistness. And given what we understand about how refined carbohydrates affect metabolism, my money is on the sugarlessness. We don't yet have, to the best of my knowledge, any randomized controlled trials comparing a whole foods plant-based diet to a whole foods animal-based diet. That would be a fair fight, and I'd be very interested to see what that would show. So simply removing animal foods from the diet is an untested intervention. But what about mental health? Do we have any studies of mental health and plant-based diets? Well, we have a few epidemiological studies. They're weak, they're mixed, they're poorly conducted. They often don't control for refined carbohydrates. That's just a problem that keeps happening. And there aren't any meaningful clinical trials. So we don't really have a lot to go on in that regard. But I would argue that we don't need more studies because we already know so much about what the brain needs. We know what it's made of, we know how it operates, we've been studying it for a long time. We don't know everything about it, of course, but we know what it's made of. So one of the mistakes that keeps happening in nutritional research is that researchers will choose their pet diet and then test it out on people with various conditions and see what happens. And they're always comparing whatever their pet diet is to the sad Western diet. And of course, it's always going to do better. And then they can say that their diet is great. I don't think we need any more studies in order to make scientifically sound recommendations about brain food. So when you study it that way, when you pick your diet and apply it, you're studying nutrition from the outside in. I prefer to study it from the inside out. What does the brain need? How do we get it there? So, when I was in psychiatry residency, 4 years of psychiatry residency after medical school, without a word about diet in 4 years, of course, I left with the impression that the brain was just a bag of neurotransmitters designed to be manipulated with medications. And, and I did that for a while until I became interested in nutrition. But of course, the brain is so much more than that. It's this beautiful, sophisticated electrical organ lined with these special fats, and it's just amazing. And billions and billions of beautiful cells, and if everything isn't constructed properly, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how many drugs you throw at it or how well your neurotransmitters are working. So, what is the brain made of? Let's start there. So, the brain is 2/3 fat. And a full 20% of that is this amazing essential omega-3 fatty acid called DHA. The brain has a lot of protein in it. Of course, every organ needs protein to build essential components, neurotransmitters and the like. The brain is loaded with cholesterol. 20% of your body's cholesterol is housed in the brain, and that despite the fact that the brain only represents 2% of your body weight. And the brain, again, an energy hog, needs a constant supply of glucose and ketones to keep it running. And in order to extract energy from those molecules, it needs lots of vitamins and minerals to run those chemical reactions. I'd like to introduce you a little bit more to DHA. So DHA is a really incredible molecule. It's been conserved over evolution for more than 500 million years in vertebrates. So vertebrates have used it as is for that length of time, and you'll find it enriched in all of these special places in the body, from mitochondrial membranes to synapses and even to the photoreceptor in the retina. It's responsible for helping to maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier as well. So interestingly, DHA is really critical for the proper development of the frontal cortex in humans, and if that doesn't go well, problems can ensue. So what is so special about this molecule? Well, it turns out that the configuration of it has quantum mechanical properties, and that just means that, and I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that it interacts with electrons in a very special way, in a couple of important ways. One is, as in the retina, in the photoreceptor, it can actually transform sunlight into electricity. And in synapses and other places in the body, it actually functions as a semiconductor, buffering electron flow. It's really quite amazing. So people much smarter than I am have hypothesized that without DHA, consciousness, symbolic thinking, intelligence, impossible. And according to this researcher, DHA plays a unique and indispensable role in the neural signaling essential for higher intelligence. So here's the rub. Plant foods contain absolutely no DHA whatsoever. They contain ALA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, but it is widely agreed that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to transform ALA from plant foods in the body into the DHA that the brain needs. This may help to explain why vegetarians and vegans have lower DHA levels than omnivores. Another powerful argument for including animal foods in the diet if you care about your brain is the micronutrient access argument. So here are some nutrients of interest. Actually, every single nutrient that the body needs can be found in animal foods, and what's more, in the most highly bioavailable form possible. Compare that to plant foods, which not only are lacking certain key nutrients, such as B12, vitamin K2, EPA, and DHA, but some of the forms of nutrients that they contain are harder for us to use, iron, for example. So to make matters even worse, plants also contain something animal foods do not contain, anti-nutrients. So anti-nutrients are chemicals, natural chemicals in plants that are there for their own purposes. But many of them interfere with our ability to utilize nutrients not only from the plant foods that we eat, but from the animal foods that we eat along with those plant foods. And I want to call your attention to a couple of them. Soy, which is an important staple protein food for people who choose a plant-based diet, interferes with iodine utilization, and that can impact thyroid function. And thyroid function is very important for the brain. And then the grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, which are really important, crucial elements of a plant-based diet because they do contain protein. They are rich in phytic acid, and phytic acid is a mineral magnet that interferes with minerals like iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium. So why is this important? It's important because, again, remember, the brain needs more nutrients than many other parts of the body because of its activity. And these nutrients are really key to brain function. If you are deficient in these, your brain may not be working at top speed. So how bad is this phytic acid problem? Here's an example. If you eat zinc-rich oysters with black beans, you will absorb less than half of the zinc from those oysters. If you eat those same oysters with corn tortillas, you absorb virtually none of the zinc from the oysters. So it's literally robbing your brain of these minerals. And this may help to explain why vegans are more likely to be inadequate in zinc than omnivores. Note that omnivores are also at risk because they do eat some of these seed foods. Iron deficiency is rampant. People think of iron deficiency, in women in particular, people think of iron deficiency as a blood problem. But iron deficiency, if you have iron, you also have a brain problem. So it's another reason why I think that meat belongs in a healthy brain healthy diet. But it doesn't have to be red meat. By meat, I mean animal foods. It can be the meat of any animal. So for example, duck is richer in iron than red meat, and oysters even more so. And when it comes to iron and B12, oysters are a powerhouse. And if you're looking for, liver is as well, it's less palatable to many people. But if you're looking for DHA, really seafood is where it's at. And if you look at this chart, salmon is included there, and it just kind of blows everybody else out of the water. So the people that I'm most concerned about when it comes to low meat or plant-based diet in terms of accessing critical brain nutrients are women. So because women are more likely to be culturally averse to eating meat and fat. That may help to explain why 3/4 of vegans are female in the United States. They're more likely to prioritize weight and appearance over health. They're more likely to prioritize animal and planet health over their own personal health for compassionate reasons. And this is not just a problem for the women that we care about in our lives, it is also a problem for the future generations because women literally feed the brains, build the brains of the next generation through their food choices. So what happens if you don't get enough DHA early in life? These are, again, just associations. We can't be sure. But children with autism are more likely to have lower levels of DHA, for example. And omega-3 supplementation doesn't seem to help very much. The critical window for obtaining DHA in young life is the 3rd trimester to age 2. Once that window closes, we may not be able to undo a lot of that damage. With ADHD, we know that children are more likely to be obese or overweight, twice as likely than their age-matched counterparts, but we don't know if there's a cause and effect relationship there. But we do know that they tend to be deficient in omega-3s, particularly DHA, EPA, and zinc and iron. Again, zinc and iron are much easier to get from animal foods than from plant foods. There's been some very interesting elimination diet studies with ADHD, putting children on what looks mostly like a whole foods diet. They threw in some margarine and some apple juice too, but just a few foods diet, and a little misguided. But these studies show remarkable results. They're flawed studies, but there are quite a few of them, and they all point in the same direction. And so why not try that? What would be the harm? So which diet do I think offers the most hope for humanity? I advocate for a pre-agricultural whole foods diet. Why? Because it contains animal foods which are rich in nutrients, so it maximizes your nutrient availability, and it's lower in anti-nutrients than a post-agricultural whole foods diet, which, like the Mediterranean diet, which will contain a lot of grains and legumes, and the phytic acid and so forth. So I think it's an excellent diet, and it makes sense, right? I mean, why should this be a radical suggestion? I mean, I can't understand why people think this is such a strange idea. So what we're up against, as we kind of wrap up here, what we're up against when I try to employ this in clinical practice is it's not as easy as it sounds to get people to switch to this diet. We're up against something I call the psychology of subtraction, which is nobody wants to take anything out of their diet. They just want to add things to it. It feels better to do that. It feels positive and empowering, active. If you take something away, that feels bad and negative and depriving. So, one of my students said to me once, she said, how can I help myself, my mental health, my depression, my anxiety, without medication in an all-natural way? And I said, well, let's take a look at trying to get the amount of sugar down in your diet. And she looked at me like I had 3 heads. And she said, but Dr. Eid, I deserve chocolate. And it's just dripping with addiction. Nobody says that about kale. So it's and the other problem we're up against is marketing. Nobody gets rich telling people to take things out of their diet. Believe me, I am proof positive of that. And so, but there's all this marketing superfoods and marketing supplements, and people really fall for this. It's such an appealing concept. So it's a hard sell. But again, so I really do think that we have all the scientific information we need to make a common sense recommendation, scientifically sound, about what foods, what dietary patterns would be better for the brain. I don't think we need more studies to be able to begin to act, is my point. It'd be great to have more studies, but we can act now. And I don't feel we need more studies. I feel we need a revolution, in the way that women feed themselves, in the way that parents feed their children, the way that schools feed their students, the way hospitals feed their patients, and the way senior centers feed their residents. Thank you.